All right, well, good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Casper. I'm the director of the Menard Center for Constitutional Studies. And tonight's program that we're happy you're all here for is we have our special guest, Bari Weiss, who is speaking on the freedom of the press and the role of new media. And this event is part of our Constitution Day programming this week at UW-Eau Claire. For those who were not aware, Constitution Day falls every year on September 17th. And that is because on September 17th, 1787, the remaining delegates at the Constitutional Convention signed the document that was eventually ratified as the Constitution of the United States. And so even though we are a few days late on that, don't worry, that means you can already get started on next year's shopping for your gifts for Constitution Day. And in addition here, when you arrived, you should have received one of these handouts, which on this side has a QR code, which you can use, or you can use the link on there as well that you can type into your phone if you'd like to ask questions, because those will be available for later in the program. Don't ask me how a QR code works. I'm a social scientist, not a scientist who deals with those sorts of things. But I am told that it will work and it has been tested out. Now, tonight's event is sponsored in part by the Menard Center for Constitutional Studies, which was established in 2016 and has the mission to promote research, education, and community outreach on matters related to the U.S. Constitution and the Wisconsin Constitution. And we are able to bring our programming to the public due to a generous gift from the Menard family. We also sponsor student scholarships, student faculty collaborative research projects, reading groups, symposia, student workshops, a host of other events with speakers and panels. And we're the ones who provided you with those pocket copies of the U.S. Constitution that were being distributed here at the beginning of the evening. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the coordinator of our center, Phil Rechek, couldn't be here this evening. He was involved in an auto accident and he is recovering from that, but he is on the mend and he is joining us watching tonight through the live stream, and the QR code, when the questions are sent in, those are sent to him, and then he will send them to our host this evening. Now, our other sponsor for the event this evening is the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And to tell you more about that center, I would like to introduce here Alexander Tak, who is the director of the Thompson Center and an associate professor of political science at UW-Madison, where he teaches in American politics as well as in statistical methodology. And he also serves as a faculty affiliate with the University of Wisconsin Law School and an honorary fellow in its Institute for Legal Studies. And so to tell you more about the Thompson Center, please join me in welcoming Professor Tak.
All right, good evening. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. The Thompson Center is delighted to be able to work with the Menard Center and UW-Eau Claire to bring Bari to campus here tonight. I want to thank Eric, Phil, whom we all really wish a speedy recovery to, Adam, everybody else at the Menard Center and at UW-Eau Claire who helped make this event possible, as well as Ruth and Mary Kate at the Thompson Center for all they do. And thank you to Bari for being here, and thank you all for being here. Let me briefly explain what the Thompson Center is for those who are unfamiliar. The Thompson Center was to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. In seeking to carry out Governor Thompson's legacy, we work to foster effective public leadership by offering public events such as this one, funding scholarship and research grants, and conducting other activities all across the UW system. It's been an honor to be able to witness and help facilitate a constructive dialogue across the campuses, as I'm sure will happen here tonight. So it's my pleasure now to introduce tonight's moderator, Adam Kuntz, who will, Adam is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at UW-Eau Claire, completed his law degree at George Washington, and after 3 years of commercial litigation, escaped to graduate school at UC Davis, where he completed his doctoral work. The happiest people I know on campus are the ones I know who are former commercial litigators and were otherwise in commercial practice. So I think that was the right move. Scholarly interests are in contemporary political theory, tolerance, the limits of religious freedom, and jurisprudence. And amongst other publications, he is soon to release his first book with the intriguing title, To Hell with Heaven, an introduction to apatheism. Well, please welcome Adam Koontz.
Thanks so much, Alex. I appreciate that. As a commercial litigator, you make a little bit more money, but as a faculty member, you get to do fun things like this. So the trade-offs are there. I have the distinct honor of being here tonight to moderate questions with Barry. And I am so happy to see all of you in attendance, both here in person and virtually. Without your support, the Menard Center could not do this kind of programming, and we're so grateful to you and your support throughout all of our programming, all of our events. Hi, Barry. Good to have you. Tonight, I am welcoming Barry Weiss here to campus. And to give you a little bit of background about her, but we'll also explore some of her background in the discussion tonight. But to give you a little bit more detail, if you don't know Barry, Barry is the founder of the editor of the Free Press and the host of the podcast Honestly. From 2017 to 2020, Barry was an opinion writer and editor at the New York Times. And before that, she was an op-ed and book review editor at the Wall Street Journal and the senior editor at Tablet Magazine. In her time as a journalist, Barry has won several awards, including the LA Press Club's 2021 Daniel Pearl Award for Courage and Integrity in Journalism, the Per Allmark Award in recognition of her moral courage, and Reason Foundation's 2018 Bastiat Prize, which honors writing that demonstrates the importance of freedom with originality, wit, and eloquence. In 2019, Vanity Fair called Barry the Times, quote, star opinion writer. Barry is a proud Pittsburgh native, a thing that Packers fans will not hold against her tonight. And her first book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, was the winner of a 2019 National Jewish Book Award. Now, if you'd like to subscribe to the Free Press, you can do so by texting the number 33777, and you'll get a link to sign up. So please welcome tonight, Barry Weiss.
Grab that microphone so you guys can hear me.
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you for having me. And just want to add my refuah shlema, as we say in Hebrew, like best wishes and speedy recovery to Phil. Phil, if you're watching this, thanks for helping organize again. And thank you to April for the warm welcome.
Absolutely. We've learned over the years that Phil is always watching us. We're in good hands. Let's just start with maybe setting some background so that we can get the audience members up to speed. We're going to be talking tonight about Free Press, the role of the Free Press. And so I would like you to share maybe a little bit of your experience and your development over your career around that subject. As a student of journalism, and then as a new journalist, and now in the station that you're at in life, how has that concept of the Free Press changed and morphed for you over your career?
Sure. Well, let me give you guys a little bit of background on who I am as a way of answering that question. Thanks for not holding the Steelers against me. I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I grew up in what now is an anomaly in American life. I grew up the child of a politically mixed marriage. My dad, a Republican, my mom, a liberal. To give you a sense of how intense that vibe is, my mom withheld sex during the 2016 election to make sure my dad wouldn't vote for Trump, and then did it again in 2020. It worked. I think he wrote in Steph Curry one year and then maybe Nikki Haley the next. So I grew up in a family, suffice it to say, where we talked about politics all the time. And disagreement didn't mean dislike, as it so often means these days in American culture. It was completely normal for us to argue about any number of things and love each other. which seems often these days like a kind of radical proposition. I always identified as a progressive, as a liberal. I took a year off and went to Israel the summer after my senior year of high school. It was a very intense time. It was sort of the end of the Second Intifada, the outbreak of the Iraq War. And I got onto campus at Columbia, and I'm not going to give you all the details, but I'll give you the big story of it, which is that I suddenly found myself in an environment that tried to tell people that in order to be part of the cool kids table and in order to be on the right side of history, you had to agree with everything that sort of progressive orthodoxy, for lack of a better term, subscribed to. And so even though I identified as pro-choice, even though I was liberal socially, even though I had voted Democratic, my views on a number of things like Republicans aren't evil, or like, defending Israel. Those put me sort of beyond the pale. And all of a sudden, I found myself in really confusing situations where people were telling me that I was like a fascist, even though I identified as a political progressive. So to make a very long story short, I never set out to be a writer or a journalist. I didn't really have any models of that so much in my life. My parents were in the carpeting and flooring business, but I found that, the rallies that I sort of joined at college turned me off. It felt like trying to distill a complicated worldview down to a slogan you could hold on a placard above your head really wasn't for me. And I found that writing columns for the student paper really, really was. And that when I thought back to my own life and the things that had shaped my views about the world and about any number of issues, it was never from someone screaming a slogan in my face. It was always because of an essay or a book or a documentary or a deep conversation. And so I sort of found myself stumbling toward a career that I had never really planned for myself. I'll give you one moment that I think I just always love thinking about it because it speaks to sort of the role that serendipity plays in all of our lives. I was doing a debate on campus with a number of campus socialists. I was on the other side of the debate. And there was an older gentleman in the room, older, like in his 70s, definitely not a college student. And he came up to me and said, "You've probably never read the Wall Street Journal." And I really hadn't. I thought it was a purely economics paper. And he said to me, "You really should go and be an intern there this summer. My son, Brett Stevens, is a columnist there, and I think you should go be his intern." And I did, and that was sort of my path into journalism. Now, for anyone in this room who knows the Wall Street Journal editorial page, it is the foremost conservative, one of the only sort of conservative editorial pages in the country. And so I found myself sort of the left-leaning most person in an otherwise conservative environment. But again, because of my upbringing, I was comfortable with that. I was really comfortable in disagreement, and I was comfortable being the odd woman out, as it were. Fast forward to the candidacy and the ultimate nomination and victory of Donald Trump. And for anyone in this room who identifies as a conservative or as a Republican, you will remember the kind of civil war that happened inside of the right that is still ongoing as the conservative movement and the Republican Party tries to figure out what they want to be. Are they the party of Trump? Are they the party of Reagan? Are they the new party of the working class? What the hell is it anymore? And that same thing happened inside the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And I found myself very much on the never Trump side of the fence. Some would say I had Trump derangement syndrome. They might be right. I did cry a lot the day after the election. Looking back, I think I have a lot more sobriety about the whole thing. And I sort of found myself all of a sudden going into a job interview at the New York Times. I ended up going to the New York Times, which everyone will remember that fateful night in 2016. Who remembers the Needle? You guys remember the Needle? The Needle told us that there was a 99.9% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election that night. And I believed that Needle. So did almost everyone that worked at the New York Times. And yet my mother, who for her business had to drive 2 hours outside of Pittsburgh, was calling me and saying, Barry, I've never seen enthusiasm for a candidate like this in my life. Donald Trump is going to win. What did my mother see that the entire staff of the greatest newspaper in the world did not? So for a brief period after that shocking election that shocked the pointy heads in places like Washington, D.C. and Midtown Manhattan, there was a sort of soul-searching period at a place like the Times and said, how did we get this so wrong? If our job is to hold up a mirror to the world as it actually is, and not our projection of a dream world, we're not doing our job very well. And so to put it bluntly, I was a kind of ideological diversity hire, which gives you a sense of how ideologically and politically homogenous the New York Times is. I've given you a little sense of my background. I should add that I'm gay, my wife and daughter are at home, and yet I was regarded as like the most right-wing person at the New York Times. And so I kind of went from the frying pan into the fire, right? I had been sort of a liberal among conservatives. Now I was regarded as a right-winger among progressives. And I'm realizing that I'm going on a very long time because I'm hyper-caffeinated. So I think the part you guys will be most interested in, for those who have never heard of me and somehow stumbled in here because maybe they gave you free pizza or something, here's like the big thing that happened. The big thing that happened was I get to the New York Times, and from day one, I was a bit of a black sheep. I had colleagues that never spoke to me because of my heretical views, which are basically the most boring, moderate political views you could imagine. And yet I had people that I would literally sit 2 desks down from who wouldn't speak to me, or who would go on Twitter and subtly sort of neg me as I was sitting desks away from them. The publisher of the New York Times lauded me in private for my courage. And at one point, she was not then my wife, but my girlfriend, who was a reporter at the New York Times, has now since left and is building this company with me, said to her, some people show their bravery on the battlefields of places like Syria and Iraq for the paper. Others show it on the 5th floor of the New York Times, which is where the op-ed page was and where I worked, which is a very curious statement because it shouldn't require bravery or courage to show up as a centrist and a newspaper in America. But the fact that he said that tells you a tremendous amount about where we are as a culture and where we are as a media culture. And so one of the things that has happened, and it very much was happening at the New York Times, is that as the model, the economic model of the press changed, right? It went from being in the generation of our grandparents and even our parents, certainly mine, that you needed to worry about pleasing the advertisers, right? You didn't want to run something that would annoy the people at Procter & Gamble. They would pull their money. Obviously, as the ad business has collapsed, another master has come in to serve that function. And that master is all of us. That master is the paying subscriber. So when you turn on Fox, it shouldn't surprise you that you're getting a certain kind of political heroin meant to satisfy you in the right ways and enrage you in the right ways that keeps you engaged. Likewise in the New York Times, right? No one needed to come down sort of from high command and say to us, run the 5,000th op-ed about how Donald Trump is a moral monster. We knew that readers wanted that. We saw that it would go viral and therefore sort of secure our position. So as much as it was uncomfortable from the time that I joined, it was also the freaking New York Times, the biggest newspaper in the world, and an opportunity not just to publish things that in front of the biggest audience of any newspaper, but also as an editor to smuggle in people who would not otherwise have thought of the New York Times as a natural place for them to publish. And by that, I mean not just libertarians and conservatives, but also dissidents from the Middle East. I remember publishing an Iranian chess champion, an underground priest in Hong Kong, incredible people, first-time writers, people from all over the world. And that was unbelievably gratifying. Fast forward, and then I promise I'll stop. Fast forward to the summer of 2020, which everyone here will remember as the sort of hottest political summer on record that maybe any of us can remember. We all were locked up in our homes. We were told that maybe this pandemic was going to kill all of us. And George Floyd is murdered and Black Lives Matter happens. And all of this conspired into an incredible panic might be a word for it. Maybe moral panic might be another word for it. And into that, the New York Times publishes an op-ed by Republican Senator Tom Cotton under the headline, "Send in the Troops." It was a very incendiary headline. And if you read the piece was nuanced. You might have disagreed with it, but it was nuanced. It basically said, this was Cotton's argument, that National Guard troops should be brought in to put down violent rioters, not peaceful protests, but violent rioters. Now, again, remember the context of that summer in early June. The response to that op-ed inside the paper was instantaneous, and it was outraged. More than 800 of my colleagues signed on to a statement saying that Tom Cotton's op-ed literally put their lives in danger. Now, I want you to think about the context for a second. This is the New York Times. We have published Vladimir Putin. We have published the leaders of Hezbollah. We have published Iranian leaders who are talking about getting a nuclear bomb. And yet somehow an op-ed by a Republican senator was deemed beyond the pale. And rather than say to those journalists, right, whose job, by the way, it is to sort of talk about the world as it is, and not suggest that the views of half of the country are unacceptable and literally put their lives in danger, rather than saying to them, if you believe that an op-ed literally puts your life in danger, this might not be the place for you to work. Instead, what happened was a sort of uprising that led to the firing of my boss and left me, I had nothing to do with the piece, but left me wondering this. If they're willing to fire in 48 hours a man who had been the Jerusalem bureau chief of this newspaper, a man who had dedicated his life to the institution, a man who's a dyed-in-the-wool liberal and agrees with basically everything this newspaper runs, if they're willing to throw him overboard for taking a risk in running a piece that other people disagree with, what might they do to me if I take a similar risk? For whatever reason, given my sort of reputation as someone who's sort of heterodox, people were sort of calling for me to be fired. They were putting little axe emojis next to my name in Slack channels, saying that if I wasn't fired, the paper couldn't be truly inclusive. I'm reminding you, I had nothing to do with this piece. And I found myself sort of at a pivotal point really in my life, which was the following: prestige or principle? Do I stay here and, at least in the context where I then lived, which was the Upper West Side of Manhattan, get the bragging rights of saying I work at the New York Times and the ability to get a very good table at most restaurants? Or do I say to myself, wait, hold on. Why did I get into journalism to begin with? Did I get into journalism to tell people I work at the New York Times so that they would be impressed with me? Or did I become a journalist to pursue my curiosity about the world? Did I become a journalist to tell the truth, even when it's politically inconvenient to me and my own biases? Did I become a journalist to sort of shine a light in dark corners, to tell the truth? And I ultimately decided to leave. And I did it in a non-subtle way. I wrote this resignation letter, which, I'll probably spend the next 40 years of my life writing, but the resignation letter will be the only thing people will read. And I left with no parachute, no plan in mind. And fast forward sort of 3 years down the line, I didn't have any of the Silicon Valley connections or the vest that they all wear. I didn't know what ROI or EBITDA was. And yet here I am, as you mentioned in your gracious introduction, running an independent media company with 20 people around the country that work for it, that are trying to, in our way, slowly but surely, pick up the flag of old school journalistic principles that the New York Times has put down. The last thing I'll say is that that story, can be told about many other people at many other publications. Just many of them are less of a loudmouth than I am. So look at Andrew Sullivan at New York Magazine, Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone, Glenn Greenwald, all of these people that are sort of Michael Schellenberger that are building the new independent media landscape, they all had their same version of my story, which basically put them at a crossroads and like the one that I described. And so, you know, if there's this big story to tell about the transformation of media and transformation of the free press, it's that a lot of these old legacy institutions, they have the prestige, they have the veneer, they have the distribution, but increasingly they don't have the trust of readers. And readers and listeners are looking for something new and independent that they can trust. And so in many ways, I've sort of never been more optimistic about the state of American press. And now I promise I'm going to keep them really short.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you giving us that background. I'm sure everybody feels a lot more able to have a conversation tonight, knowing your experience with journalism. Let's talk about, because you've mentioned a few things with regard to mainstream media. So let's focus on mainstream media for just a moment here. To what extent do you think that the mainstream media does get it right, especially when it comes to the free press? What are some things that maybe historically are the hallmarks of this is a vigorous press? This is what a good press looks like.
Historically or now?
Or even now, right? To what extent do you see those things even today in the mainstream media?
Sure. I mean, to be clear, I subscribe to the Washington Post, the New York Times, all of it. I read all of it. One of the first thing that comes to mind, Adam, when you ask that question is foreign coverage.
Okay.
And it's not to say that it's not incredibly biased. It has its biases. It's only that if you want to send a journalist into Ukraine, or you want to send a journalist into Yemen, the amount of reason you cannot be an independent person with a newsletter and just drop yourself into a war zone. The body armor alone is like your year's salary. So that sort of institutional support, legal support, what happens if you get kidnapped? Like that is one reason that institutions remain extraordinarily important. The other thing that comes to mind is that, you know, we're living in this very strange time where, you know, depending on what your YouTube or TikTok algorithm serves up to you, you could find yourself sort of held captive by, you know, one or several online gurus, you know, who don't have any obligation, don't have any sort of gatekeeping, maybe would be the word, don't have fact checking, don't have copy edit, don't have any of the sort of layers, to say nothing of like the mission statement. You know, I still read the mission statement of the New York Times and I'm like, yes, I believe that. I don't think they're living up to it, but I believe that. And that is just super different than online pundits who make money through you clicking and watching and being outraged for as long as possible. And so foreign coverage is one thing, but it really connects to the bigger thing, which is the institutional framework, right? We live in a moment, whether you're thinking about the New York Times or the CDC or the Department of Education or the FBI, like we're in a moment of institutional distrust. You could even say it's a pandemic of distrust. So what happens in a moment like that? People trust individuals. I can trust you, Adam, because I only need to know that I trust one person, as opposed to a nameless, faceless bureaucracy with thousands of people. You know, that's a much easier proposition for people now. The challenge, of course, is that, you know, one individual can be susceptible to audience capture, can be, you know, just feed their audience, the audience exactly what they're seeking, doesn't have any sort of higher moral principle other than making a buck. Some of them do, but some of them don't. And I think that that's really the tension, is that it's very hard to have a democracy without institutions. And it's very hard to have a healthy democracy without trust in those institutions. And so one of the things I wake up, because I'm a dork, every day thinking about is, how do you rebuild trust in institutions? What are the ones that can be salvaged and reformed, and what are the ones that need to be built anew? And that, I think, is like one of the most pressing questions of our moment for the media and other institutions as well.
So do you think that, you know, we talk about the press as being like the fourth estate, the fourth branch of government that examines the behavior of government and communicates that to the citizens? Do you think that is an institution that is capable and susceptible of reform, given what you've told us, or do you think it does need to be built anew?
It depends on the institution.
Okay.
Right? I will say being on the other side, being on the side of I'm building something new, whether with the Free Press or I'm on the board of a new university in Texas called UATX that is going to welcome its first freshman class in 2024. Building new things is just about the hardest thing you can possibly imagine. Like it is so unbelievably difficult. You have to answer what do we do about a correction? What's our system for that? What's our system for headline writing? Name it. You have to start from scratch. So do that only when the reform option is not possible, right? In my case, I feel that there is a huge opening for the kind of thing I'm trying to do in the press. But in the case, let's say, of politics, there are a lot of people who are talking about building a third party. I don't know if that's plausible with our system right now.
Sure.
To me, it seems more plausible to sort of reform the ones that currently exist. So again, it just depends on the area and it depends on the specifics of the institution. Everyone here will have their own examples and only you can know whether reform or building anew is the right answer. I definitely believe that journalism is essential for democracy. And one of the things, though, that's so strange about our current moment is that too often the legacy press seems almost fused with power rather than skeptical of power. To give you only one example, I was one of the journalists that was involved in the reporting of the Twitter files when Elon Musk bought Twitter, and I got a text message from him at 6 p.m. on a Friday night. I was there with my wife. Our baby was 3 months old, and he said, "How quickly can you be at Twitter headquarters?" And we were on a flight 2 hours later, walked in at midnight, and thus began the most insane 2 weeks of reporting of my life. And that was a really important litmus test moment because here we were discovering that not only had Twitter done the thing that it had claimed not to do, which was suppressing certain viewpoints, to put it just the headline, right? It was also collaborating with major institutions of the federal government bureaucracy. Now, in a normal world, you would think that would be big news. And yet it was a story that for half of the country was like the biggest story in the world. And the other half didn't even know that it existed. Or if it existed, it was sort of branded as irrelevant fake news, which gives you a really important sense of sort of where things are. So journalism is very important. It's just right now, strangely, some of the most important stories are being pursued by people independently and sort of outside of those legacy institutions.
So you mentioned in talking about your experience as a journalist with mainstream media that part of this is because of the economic shift. That prior, broadcast media and even print media relied pretty heavily on advertising dollars in order to do their work. And now there's been a shift to more the subscription model and the consumption model. The cynic in me, the 2 o'clock in the morning cynic, would say, well, the Elon Musk example and the YouTube influencer might look different to us, but it's no different than Philip Morris shutting down a report on smoking in the 60s. It's no different than General Motors not wanting us to report on a union strike. And in that way, then power has always been this. It's just that now we have a different version of it. Talk to me about why you see our situation as somehow unique in that long trajectory of power.
It's a great question. I think it has to do with the seismic technological revolution that we're living through.
Okay.
Which is to say that, there's a lot of people who understandably right now feel information overload, and they're like nostalgic for the days of Walter Cronkite where everyone watched the same thing. It was great in that everyone was watching the same thing and could have, conversation over the water cooler because they had the same cultural context, but they also had no other options. Right? It was a stranglehold. It was, 2 or 3 stations and 2 or 3 newspapers. And you didn't have the ability because you didn't have the internet to be skeptical of what you were hearing in the same way. So as much as I understand the nostalgia for not living in a totally balkanized culture, I'm also very grateful that we're living through a moment where like the tools of the trade are available to anyone. Now, that means that an absolute conspiracy theory QAnon Pizzagate nut can get on a microphone in front of a ring light and garner hundreds of millions of views. That's the bad part of it. The good part of it is that, to give you a personal example, I was really interested in the trucker rebellion in Canada. If you guys remember that, it was a really interesting working class thing. And I was following this Canadian journalist, Rupa Subramanya. And I was like, holy shit, this woman is amazing. Like, I want her to write for us. And, you know, she wrote an incredible story, and now she's a full-time employee at the Free Press. And I never would have heard of her. She never, like, none of that ever would have happened. And a few weeks ago, she went and got the first interview with Oliver Anthony before Joe Rogan. None of that would have happened without Twitter. None of it. So for all of the horrible, and trust me, like, if go look in my mentions, it's the worst, but it's also the best to some extent. And so while I agree with you on the, like, power will do what it will do, that is true. And just as Philip Morris would shut down, a great example, report on smoking, you know, I think YouTube today or yesterday announced that given the allegations against Russell Brand, they're demonetizing him. That's going to happen forever and ever, amen, always. The difference, of course, is like, okay, now there's Rumble. You know, now there's alternatives now, and it might not be as powerful. And Google does have 90% market share, but there are alternatives. And, you know, democracy comes with, you know, the ability for cranks to find an audience, but also the ability for real undiscovered stars who deserve an audience to find one.
So in other words, because it's become much more driven by consumers and we now have so many outlets to be able to choose from, the burden is shifting more to us to be good consumers in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think it's going to shift, right? I think we're in this weird liminal place where the legacy places still exist. Their audience, look at the audience of CNN in a week versus the audience of Joe Rogan in one episode. Tells you a lot about what people want.
Sure.
And where people are shifting. The difference, of course, is that, you know, you used to pick up the Washington Post or the New York Times, be like, I can believe what's there. How do I know what this YouTuber's saying? I don't have time. I'm an accountant. I'm a lawyer. I'm a mom. I don't have time to fact check 3.5 hours, right? That is the real problem that we're facing, is how do you know what to believe? Who's credible and who isn't? When someone says they're an expert because they have the pedigree, are they actually an expert? Or is the expert actually the person who consistently gets things right? Like, these are like the questions of the internet age, period. They're the questions that anyone who's living through an information revolution would face. And I think ultimately you're going to start to see some of these, like, I think that the way that you used to trust some of those old places, you're going to come to trust some of the new places simply because they consistently get it right over time. And you will watch and see the people that decide to look for the sort of to have a short-term mindset, looking for the ads and the profit, and the people who decide, you know what, I'm going to dedicate my life to building a long-term institution whose currency is integrity and trust. And I hope that I'm in that second camp.
So, I mean, let's talk pragmatic here for a second, though. When you're talking about the need to find the people who get it right, how do I do that when I've got an algorithm that's desperate for me to keep staying on the app, right? To consume content, and is constantly going to be feeding me things that are going to be clickbait to keep me there. Advertising dollars that are geared towards my interests because of the privacy that I'm selling to them. And, you know, I look at my 4-year-old son who every now and then gets on YouTube, and all it takes is 3 or 4 clicks and he's off on some tangent. And I wonder, how did he get there? And it's simply because of the platform. So what can we do? What can I do at, 2 a.m. when I don't have those guardrails up? What
I think you might need a sleeping pill because you're up a lot at 2 a.m.
Do you know that the reality is that nothing will touch it, but go ahead, but we'll work on that.
I mean, this is the question that every single one of us face. Yeah. To put myself on the hook, I don't know if you guys saw that viral image of the Pope in the white puffer. Do you guys see that? I literally thought that was a real picture until one of the 20 somethings I work with were like, that is fake. That is AI art. And I mean, we haven't even touched on AI,
Sure,
like what
yeah,
that's going to do
right,
to all of us. You
right.
can now go online and if you're a single guy or maybe even not a single guy or girl, develop an AI girlfriend that meets all of your specifications. It's like that movie Her, if you guys have seen that incredible prophetic movie, or Ex Machina, a little darker even than Her. We're in a brave new world. Like, I don't know, I don't know. How do you contend with a tsunami? Because that's what this is. I'll tell you the things that I do that are laborious and take time. And ultimately, one of the reasons we're building the company in the Free Press is because we want to solve that problem for people. Like, what happens after every single talk I give is someone will raise their hand, and the first question inevitably will be, what should I read? I used to go in my car and turn on NPR Morning Edition. But then they said X and Y and Z, so I don't really know if I should trust them anymore. Or I used to read the newspaper. I don't know what I should trust anymore. What should I read? And I inevitably have to send them this email that I've developed over the past few years, which is like, here are the 20 newsletters and the 30 Twitter feeds and the 5 podcasts. And they're like, no, one place. I want it one place. That ultimately over time is what I want to do for people. I want to curate the things that are deserving of your time and trust, so that you only have one place that you need to check and read. Until we do that, and we are doing that, for now, what I do is I try and be offline completely from sundown on Friday night to sundown on Saturday. I don't always completely keep to it, but I have found as an internet addict that is up at 2 a.m, like you, that was crucial for my sanity. Limiting the amount of time that you spend on social. Like, I haven't downloaded TikTok for a reason. I'm too scared, not just of China spying on me, but of the addictive element of it. I mean, these are like highly potent drugs, these algorithms, and they should be understood that way and used with the kind of caution that we would approach weed or alcohol, especially among kids. I think we're going to live through a major transformation of the way that we sort of like cultural mores around social media for kids in the next 10 years, as we see more and more studies. And Jonathan Haidt has done the best work on this, but and also Jean Twenge, who wrote this book, iGen, like what this does, especially to teenagers in terms of anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation. I mean, it is really like the evidence is in, and it's increasingly in. So being restrained in the way I use it, in the same way that I wouldn't go out, especially because now I'm old and I would have a terrible hangover. I'm not going to have 6 cocktails in a night. Like, I don't think it's a good idea to be on Twitter for 5 hours a day in the same way. And also, frankly, like being really like, as a political matter, thinking about big tech the way that we once thought and currently think about Philip Morris. Like, it is strange to me that there is not more. I mean, in a way it's not, right? How, when you can go on Uber Eats and get a burger delivered here by the time we get off the stage, like that kind of convenience is intoxicating.
Sure.
And it's like numbing in a way. So it's hard to be skeptical of the people that brought you the burger in 5 minutes, but it's really politically important that we are, because it's reconstituting everything about the way we live. And journalistically, the way that I deal with that is like, make that a beat, make that something that we constantly are interrogating and doing investigative research, reporting into, and treating that with the same, treating that power with the same kind of skepticism that we would treat, you know, the people that march us off into a war.
Sure. So about social media, we've seen a significant amount of shifting, though, even just in the last year. You mentioned Elon Musk and his ownership of Twitter and the changes that he has made. We've seen advertisers bail out of Twitter. There have been TikTok bans that have been put in place. There's been a decrease in the consumption of Facebook and new users on Facebook. It seems like the landscape is changing. Do you think that's because the consumption that you're talking about is changing with it? Or do you think that this is signaling that there's going to be something new that takes its place? So insofar as social media, that landscape is shifting, what do you hope will replace it in some way?
Well, Facebook might be down, but TikTok and Snap are probably up. So there's always going to be a new kid on the block making something more incredible and addictive. As for Twitter, I know that I'm spending significantly less time on it because it's just worse.
Sure.
You know, who-
I went to Blue Sky this last month and it's been a breath of fresh air.
I've heard Blue Sky's great. I don't know how to get an invitation. Maybe you can
I'll
help
send
me.
you one. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, Elon Musk is not a guy long-term to typically bet against, given what he is accomplishing in space and electric cars. But right now, Twitter is a lot of ads for edibles and, you know, urban crime videos that don't do anyone very much good at all. So I'm spending personally less time on it. I'll say that there's, you know, I'll give you one example of a model that I think is very, very cool. Substack. I'm just curious, who in this room has heard of Substack? Okay, that's good. At least half. So, you know, Substack's model is like, rather than making you the product, which is the model of a lot of these other places, they're saying you should pay for great content and then you should be part of sort of our much more thoughtful, deep, politically diverse platform that genuinely values free speech, like walled garden. And they're trying to develop Substack Notes, which is essentially their version of Twitter. And like, that's a much more generative place to be. Now, will that scale? Will that have the kind of network effect that Twitter has? I don't know. I'm not a technologist, but I know personally like where I'm shifting my attention and time. And to go onto an app like Substacks and be driven to writers like Luke Burgess or Rob Henderson or Patty Smith is on there. Amazing people are on it. And be driven toward reading things that are longer and deeper and more thoughtful than the outrage that sucks me into the sort of doom spiral at Twitter. I think that's a good thing. We'll see. I mean, we'll see. One of the like great lessons of the past decade is you just don't know what's going to be next around the corner.
Yeah. One of the things we talk a lot about in constitutional law is when there's a civil liberty, whether it's free speech, religion, or press, we talk a lot about its limits and whatever guardrails need to be put up around those liberties, if any. You've already kind of mentioned one, which is that we need to be more mindful in our own consumption, certainly. But are there other guardrails that you think that we should as a society impose? There's examples of maybe some more extreme ones of actual legislation banning a social media company. There's also, so-called cancel culture, et cetera. What kinds of guardrails do you think should be put around to protect the free press, if any?
Look, I think you're the constitutional lawyer, not me. So you're going to have a better answer. And I'm really curious what you think. But one thing that's clear is that the old town square, as the founders conceived of it, doesn't really exist anymore. Like, we're not going to go out in the middle of Eau Claire and get a soapbox and scream our, Cornel West for president. We're going to do that on Twitter or Facebook or Google. Like, those things are the town square. And what happens when the town square gets digitized, but none of the rights that we have in the physical town square, the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment and all of those other radical, revolutionary, world-changing things, we don't have those because those are just private companies.
Right.
And so I think the high school answer is, well, they're just private companies. We just have to deal with it. But is that really the answer? And so I don't know the right way to remedy that, but I'm reading a tremendous amount about it and curious about ultimately if these things are going to be understood and sort of put into a legal framework like the railroad company or the electric company. Maybe the solution is simply more competition. I don't know. I just know that simply asserting they are private companies, so they should do whatever they want. No, not when that's where if your bank or PayPal decides to drop you because 5 years from now it becomes, verboten to have voted for Trump in 2016. I'm just picking something.
Sure.
Do we want to live actually in a country, in a culture where it's acceptable to essentially unperson and debank someone because of their political views? I don't think so. Like, I don't think that's in keeping with the most sort of core foundational liberal and democratic values.
So do you, I mean, you mentioned the idea of like the public carrier. Where do you stand on that?
I don't, because I don't have a sophisticated enough understanding of it. But I'm, I read Clarence Thomas's dissent in that
Sure.
decision. You'll probably know the
Right.
case because I'm not thinking of the name of it.
That's Eric's job, honestly.
Okay.
But yeah.
Eric, do you remember it? Okay. But I haven't written about that because
Sure.
I don't know. I've written reported pieces that are just trying to sort of synthesize for the reader and for myself, like, here are the different sort of buckets of solution to
Yeah.
this problem that we're clearly facing as a country. As for rules and regulations, look, no one wants to be on a social media site that's just giving them like gutter content. That's just, it's bad business.
Sure.
Like, so there are things, excuse me, that like moderation is baked in. There has to be moderation. The question is always just what falls in the sort of 40-yard lines of acceptable political discourse and what doesn't. And I fall into the camp, and I'm someone that gets a tremendous amount of like anti-Semitic hate and other kind of hate online, that ultimately, though, I tend to fall on the side of those who say we should make as much, not acceptable, but we should moderate as liberally as possible.
Okay.
And the reason I feel that way is simply because those people will express themselves. They're just going to go on to gab.com, which is where the guy that walked into the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah got radicalized and then murdered 11 Pittsburgh Jews. So it's a very sensitive question. And I think one of the things, though, that is radicalizing many people in this country is the sense that the companies that claim to be sort of for free speech or for an open debate were actually putting their thumb on the scale of a certain political viewpoint. And it's leading them to all kinds of conclusions about how the system is rigged and it leads to sort of a rabbit hole that I think is ultimately really dangerous for us. And so if there's like one rule of thumb I have, it's transparency. For all of the bad things I think Elon Musk is doing with Twitter, and I think there's a lot of bad things, I think one good thing that he did was to say transparency is good. And it's a good thing for people to know the way that we get you guys addicted to this platform. And
Right.
it's a good thing to know how the previous leadership moderated things. And I think that the more transparency we have into these platforms, that's a very good place to start.
So that kind of opens us up to maybe looking at this even more broadly, just free speech in general and civil discourse, because you mentioned in this the need to moderate liberally. And without getting too sensitive about this, you have written a book on anti-Semitism, and you're a vocal a proponent of Israel. When it comes to topics around free speech, how far are you willing to tolerate what would otherwise be harmful speech? This is a topic that's very, very salient to students, to faculty in general. It's the question of allowing the marketplace of ideas and speakers versus this is demonstrably harmful to me and to my identity. And the example that I'm thinking of is the recent neo-Nazi protest at Disney World that happened about a week ago or so. Are
I
you
feel like there's one like every other week
yeah,
these days.
that's the one that's sticking in my brain. But these were people who literally had no problem being called a Nazi. And so I don't use that term accidentally. Would you want them silenced?
No.
So where then for you is the line between that liberal marketplace of ideas versus this is harmful?
There's the personal answer that I have,
Sure.
and then there's the principle that I want to live by answer.
Let's do both.
Well, the personal answer is when I see how flagrant just to choose anti-Semitism as an example, like there's no shame around it anymore, right? It used to be that if you were a neo-Nazi, you would have to like find a private group to go meet in some basement somewhere, because that was just considered anathema in American life. No, now it's proud, and it's proud online, and it's proud in sort of ironic, funny ways. And as someone who is, you know, stood in the synagogue at Tree of Life as people from the FBI were cleaning up the body parts of people in my neighborhood, suffice it to say, I'm pretty like aware of where that ideology goes
Sure.
and how evil I think those ideas are. But I also truly believe that the way that you defeat evil, barbarous ideas is with other better ideas. That's just like, maybe that's considered radical or maybe incredibly naive. But that's, to me, that's like one of the lessons of history. Like, how did every progressive movement win rights for the people who were left behind or second class? How did the suffrage movement work? How did the movement to end slavery work? How did the civil rights movement work? How did the gay rights movement work? Was it by saying, oh, you bad homophobe, we're going to throw you in jail? No. It was by going out and saying, and using rhetoric and using the unbelievable power of personal example. And as Harvey Milk said it, by coming out and showing people that gay people were everywhere around you. All of those progressive movements, and this is just in America, but like all of those progressive movements in American life, speech was the thing that made them possible. It wasn't by saying to other people, we are going to shut you down. It was by making the better argument. And so as much as when I see neo-Nazis, whether it's, you know, years ago marching in Skokie or standing outside of Disney World or going on the internet and saying that I'm a reptile that, you know, is part of the protocols of the elders, whatever the hell they're saying.
Sure.
Like, they disgust me, as I hope they disgust everyone in this room. But I really believe that the power, like true power, is like the real way to defeat them is by making the better argument.
But just to push back a little.
Please, yeah. And I'm so curious, what do you think?
I don't know. I don't have thoughts.
You don't have thoughts?
No, I get paid to teach. But within this context though, I mean, what if, and you're from a historically marginalized group that's dealt with a significant amount of oppression and hostility and violence. I can hear other voices in the room that would say, but I have done enough. I've done enough. I have suffered enough. I shouldn't now also have to educate the Nazi.
I'm not saying you have to educate the Nazi, to be
Okay.
clear. Like, I'm not spending my time flying down to Disney World and
We could
standing.
go though. if
We
you want,
could.
yeah.
We should probably get high and then go.
Yeah,
But
Great,
standing,
on board.
like, I'm not gonna go and like someone's there calling me a pig and stand up with a sign saying, no, I'm not really a pig. I'm not wasting my time doing that.
Sure.
When I say make the better argument, I'm not saying, you know, argue with someone who's saying to me, I'm less than human. No. I'm simply saying that the way to defeat those who believe that I'm less than human is by being a full person and using the unbelievable rights accorded to me in this country that have, in my view, made it the greatest country in the history of the world. Like, not to spend my time and availing myself of all those rights, rather than spending my time saying, ban this person from Facebook because they're bad. That's just me.
So in other words, I mean, you're wanting to reach out to the other listeners. So in the conversation between the Nazi and
I'm
you.
saying, who's the audience? The
who
audience is not the
listens to-
Nazi.
Yeah.
The audience is the person, I can't believe we're talking so much about Nazis, but the audience is the person that's like maybe thinking to themselves, the audience is the audience is not the hater. The audience is the person who might genuinely wonder, like, yeah, why are so many Jews in Hollywood, and having conversation with that person and like being able to sort of separate out those who are bent on dehumanization and destruction and those people who are genuinely like ignorant. And I mean ignorant in a neutral way,
neutral
who
sense.
don't know.
Because this ultimately is a university, but to bring it home for us, what can we as a campus, as students, as faculty, as the broader university community, what role do universities play in all this? What role would you see as someone who has started a heterodox university? What do you see our role in all of this?
Kind of the most important of all. Like, it turns out that, I'll give you an example from my own life. When I was a student at Columbia, I remember getting into an argument with someone who tried to tell me that societies that I couldn't judge societies that performed female genital mutilation because it was essentially a kind of cultural oppression for me to do so, that they were entitled to their own culture, and who was I to sort of bring my feminist views and to suggest that, I don't know, women around the world had the right to pleasure and not have their genitals mutilated. And I remember being like, what the hell is this? Like, what view is this? Well, now that view, call it cultural relativism, postmodernism, whatever you want, we're like awash in it. It's like the whole culture, at least parts of it, at least the parts I live in. And the only reason I bring that up is that ideas really, really matter, like for good and ill. And the ideas that you marinate in during these most formative years of your intellectual development shape who you are and what you want to do and the way you want to reshape the country and the world. And if you're in an environment that says the views of half of the country are evil and shouldn't be engaged with, if you're in an environment that says that person's speech offended me and therefore they need to be cast out, if you're in an environment that says your identity is more important than your ideas, like, that's going to shape the next generation of people leading the country, running the institutions of American life. You know, there's this crazy survey that came out from this thing called the Challey Innovation Global something something. Challey is the word Challey, if people want to look it up. And they were surveying, they were trying to get a sense of the way cultural norms have changed on American college campuses. And in that study, 70% of students said that they favored reporting their professors to university bureaucracy if that professor said something that they felt was beyond the pale or that offended them. And they were admitting that to the person running the survey, which tells you, like, which should sound alarm bells to anyone hearing that. Reporting your professor because they said something that offended you? Like, isn't that the whole point of what a university is supposed to be about? When did the right to be protected from offense become something sacred? That should be something that's rejected. If you're not getting offended, like, you're not doing it right, frankly. I was offended all the time in college. And that doesn't mean offended like a professor singling you out and humiliating you.
What
It
about
just means ideas, like coming into contact with ideas that you haven't encountered before is the whole point of going to university. It's the whole point of an education. How can you know what you believe if all you're hearing back is an echo of what you already came in believing? That just sounds unbelievably boring to me. It's not why I would go to school. And so what can you be doing? Maybe getting into conversations with professors and other students who aren't like you. Maybe seeking those out. Maybe reading books that, you know, you hadn't encountered before. And just generally like cultivating like one thing I think we're seeing is that you can have a constitution, but you can have a culture that doesn't reflect the values in it. And I think understanding that and cultivating a culture here or wherever for people watching that actually upholds those values is just incredibly, incredibly valuable.
Well, this seems like a good opportunity for us to shift to the Q&A portion. And we've done it a little bit differently. So Phil, the eyes in the sky here, has been receiving questions through our QR code. Yeah. And he's been sending them along. And I will say to the audience, we've gotten an overwhelming number of questions. Phil has told me you got about 50 some odd questions, which of course we don't have all time for. Never-
I'll answer real fast.
We'll do it. Yeah. Well, Phil's done the hard work of putting them into some themes, and I've been seeing them as they kind of come in. And so I'm going to try my best to be able to give as many questions as we can and to try to hit on all the themes as we can. And if your question did not get addressed, I'm sure Barry's active on social media. You can always message
Let's
her.
try and do all 50 and I'll try and do them as like tight 2 sentences for each.
Okay. Well, then this seems like a good segue question because a student is asking this. And the question is, so it's great to be a student who is trying to, meet people who are controversial and to engage with other ideas. But what advice would you give to a student that feels that they're afraid to disagree, or they're afraid because of the campus culture or wherever it may be? Maybe it's a conservative student in a room that they perceive as liberal, or a liberal student. I went to a very conservative college campus and I felt afraid to speak often. So what advice would you give for a person like that?
If you're that person, please meet me after, because I understand, because I was you and I've been you in so many rooms, more rooms than I can count. Just depending on the context, as you were saying, Adam, I've been the odd person out many, many times. The first thing I'll say is that you will be surprised how contagious your courage is. The example of a single person willing to be different can change everything. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that it's really normal to feel afraid of standing out, and afraid, especially in a culture in which everything you do can be captured forever, to be nervous. I'm sorry. One of the things I have found is that if you find 2 or even one other person, or 2 people, if you're lucky, who, even if they don't agree with you, will support you in being willing to be different, that can also make a huge difference. So trying to seek those people out can be great. It's kind of like allergies.
It's the plant and it's pollen. Another question that I think gets back to us consuming the news is that I think a lot of us, and there's been a few surveys that have come out on this. Pew, I think, just did a research about political burnout. I think something like 2/3 of Americans are feeling just completely exhausted.
I saw that. I tweeted that today because I was like, that is the free press total addressable market, which
Sure.
is the majority of Americans.
Right. So what would you say to those of us in that category? Because I put myself in that
Me too.
category. I'm burnt out, and it's another election year coming up. If I'm just exhausted, what can I do to overcome that exhaustion, to be proactive and mindful in my consumption?
Yeah.
Aside from the detaching, you've already given us one example,
Yeah,
but
I think switching your aperture. I think that the big spectacle, of course, is, the inevitable, maybe not inevitable, please God, no, but the Biden versus Trump showdown. But you have to ask yourself, like, how much does that affect this community in Eau Claire? How much does that affect you? Or are there other local issues that really actually you could make a huge difference and that deserve your attention? So just speaking for myself in my own context in LA, crime and homelessness in LA is actually much more urgent in the day-to-day lives of most people that live in Los Angeles than is the president. The presidency is very important. Like, I'm a political junkie, I'm going to focus on it. But I think switching the aperture from the federal to the local can be a really good way to sort of re-engage in a way that's healthy and manageable again for people.
okay. And on that a little bit, because you are, after all, the editor of a free and independent press organization, what would be the role of the independent news outlet in that climate of political burnout?
Looking for stories that surprise, provoke, delight, and aren't just about the things you'd expect. I'll give you one example. We're going to do a tremendous amount of coverage on 2024, of course, but one story that I was working on with a writer this week is about, you know, the surprising, the changing demography of the GOP, and especially among Asian Americans. And the story is focusing on 4 or 5 former Democrats, now Republicans, Asian Americans running for Congress. And it's like, that's a surprising story. That's a story that's like a lot of people would be interested in. That's not about this indictment, that indictment. I can't even keep them straight. Like that kind of thing, I think is important. And telling the stories that just others aren't telling, I think is really significant. I'm interviewing James Carville tomorrow night in Austin. And one of the things I want to ask him about is unbelievably low turnout rate among Black voters. That to me seems to be a really important story. What are they seeing that they're dissatisfied with in Biden and the current state of the Democratic Party?
You mentioned when we're talking with others and we're engaging in this discourse, that really we're trying to speak to those who maybe are unaware of the issues or just ill-informed on the issues, not really the one who's already made up their mind. But a phenomenon that we see a lot, especially in social media, is the idea of the political silo and the echo chamber. And so how would you, a lot of my students will bring this up depending on what their family background is. How would you talk to somebody who's maybe not the person who's completely made up their mind, but they're consuming so much that is that echo chamber? They're isolated in essence. How do you have dialogue with someone like that? And what advice can you give to speaking to a person who seems to be isolated in this way?
If you're talking about your parents or your grandparents who are either MSNBC grandmas or Fox News grandfathers, do something helpful for them and unplug their television. That'd be one thing to do. I'm so sorry. I'm
You're okay.
really having some kind of like allergy attack. How do you talk across that divide? It's very hard. I mean, this is like the ultimate Thanksgiving. Like, how do you go home and talk to people who have like a different understanding of what happened that day in the world than you do, which is really possible. Like, you know, my grandma thinks I'm a fascist because she watches Rachel Maddow nonstop and Lawrence O'Donnell every single night. And like, that's her view of things. I'll tell you how I do it. First of all, with humor always, and a sense of like, you know, as important as politics is, and like politics really matters to me, my family matters to me more. And being just super clear on my values, and in the end of the day, like what truly matters. Does what truly matter in the end of the day, is it the way that someone I love voted? Or is it that they show up when I'm sick or when I need help with the baby? Like, I know that sounds basic, but it feels a little bit like we've lost that.
Well, not reducing everything to politics.
Yeah, it's not reducing everything to politics. And I also find that like there are things that are almost like perpendicular to the main conversation that could be a really good way in. So if the main conversation is Hunter Biden's laptop or the Georgia Trump indictment, like maybe don't start there. Like maybe a more interesting way to start is like, I heard this really interesting episode of the Rest is History podcast, or I listened to something really interesting on Freakonomics. Let's talk about it. You know, something that doesn't divide so neatly red, blue, but is more purple and is just like interesting fodder for deep. Because I understand like people want to talk about politics and religion because they're actually important and they matter in people's lives. You know, they always tell you like, don't talk about politics or religion on the first date, but of course you want to. It's the most interesting thing. But there are other ways to talk about politics and religion that are not, don't believe in God, or do believe in God, or vote for Donald Trump, or don't vote for Donald Trump. And I think finding those like other ways in can be really, really great.
Speaking of religion, just because it's a topic near to my heart, when we have these conversations across ideological lines, how much of it do you think is fueled by religious belief? How much do you think religious belief is causing these fractures, or do you think one's the cart and one's the horse, in other words?
I thought about this question a lot. There is a really wonderful book that I recommend to everyone here called The Righteous Mind.
Oh, yeah.
By Jonathan Haidt. And one of the big takeaways from it is the sort of like Emile Durkheim insight that, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that we all sort of have a religious yearning or a God-shaped hole inside of us. And that can be filled in really positive ways, or that can be filled in really negative tribal ways. And I think one of the things we're seeing right now is, traditional religion is down, church attendance is down. We see pockets of kind of religious revival, like, that are really interesting to me. But that impulse goes somewhere. And I think a lot of the time where that impulse is going is toward politics. People are treating politics like a faith and like a team. And like anyone who doesn't ascribe to their team is condemned in some kind of way. So I definitely think that's a part of what's going on.
Just a couple more questions and then we'll let you get some breath here. No,
Sorry,
you're good. No,
I don't know what's going
I totally get it. You talked a lot about the next generation, and as somebody who's a parent, I have a 4-year-old going on a 5-year-old, and there's people in the room who are parents. How much should we, and you are a parent as well, how much should we be worried about the future with regard to social media and platforms that we obtain news from, and what can families be doing to kind of counteract that fear of being sucked into the maelstrom?
I think it takes a lot of discipline, but as strict as you can be about limiting screen time and time on social, it just seems to be like a really, really smart way to go. I don't stand in judgment. Like, we were on a cross-country flight the other day and our daughters won. And I was like, I pray for the moment that she's into Coco Melon or Paw Patrol so that I don't need to be entertaining her for 5 hours.
Sure.
So I get it. And I'm sure that will only become more intense. But there's a really interesting campaign that we've written about called Wait Till 8th about social media and really making it a sort of like new moray that you wouldn't allow your child to be on Instagram comparing herself to everyone else's bodies in 7th grade at the time she's going through puberty. Like, that seems to be a kind of commonsensical good idea.
Sure.
And one that I haven't yet faced, but I'm married to a woman who's not letting our child do any screens till the time she's 2. So suffice it to say, like, we're going to try and go that route.
Fight that good fight.
Yeah.
Good luck. When they encounter Blippi, that's when it all falls apart. One other question and this is going to get really philosophical, but it's an interesting one. You mentioned, and I think at one point you'd mentioned the idea of like post-truth and, fake news, et cetera. How do we, to what extent can we measure for ourselves what that truth is when we see it out there? So you and I are both reading the same story. Let's say it's Pizzagate, for instance, right? How do we take in that same information, and how do we know from an objective way, this is what I'm seeing is true? How can I assess that if I'm a person stuck in this world?
Well, this is where like the idea that I believe Jefferson talked about is of like an educated citizenry is essential for the upholding of democracy. Like, if you don't have educated, skeptical people that can look at that story and say, I don't know if it would be possible to run a conspiracy of pedophiles among the most powerful people in American life and have nobody find out about it. Like, to be skeptical about that story, you need to have the tools of skepticism that an education provides. And so that's where like what you guys all are doing here is actually extraordinarily significant. And I think that, many problems to choose from in American life, the total utter collapse of giving people a basic education in huge parts of this country is really important. There's a podcast I'd recommend called Soul to Story that focuses on reading levels among children in 4th grade. That's really, really excellent. If people haven't heard it yet, it was very eye-opening to me. We had her on my podcast, honestly. One of the challenges, right, is that there's actual misinformation. And then there's people that are using the label of misinformation to shut down people that they disagree with. And that's where it becomes really confusing, right?
Mhm.
It was considered misinformation and conspiracy theorizing. Don't forget to suggest that the COVID might have come from a lab. People were kicked off of social media for entertaining that idea and smeared as xenophobes and worse. Well, now it looks like that it probably came from a lab. You know, there's a great Jon Stewart clip on that talking about Colbert. Same with, you know, the idea of masking kids or any of the number of things. So it's impossible to be able to discern, which is like the thing you're asking about, right? Is discernment without being educated and being skeptical and having the tools that a great education provides.
Which is all the more reason for us to have conversations and to speak up about these so that we can educate one another. Last year we had Megan Phelps Roper visit us, and I had a wonderful conversation with her. And I think you worked with her a couple of times on a variety of projects, but I asked her this question at the end of that conversation. And I want to give it the same question to you here as we wrap up. What hope do you have for the future? Knowing that, you know, you and I, are about the same age. We're aging millennials. We got a lot of life left.
Rapidly aging.
Yeah. I've got a sciatica thing going on today. But as we see the future and as we see the next generations coming in our stead, what kinds of hopes do you have for the future? Are you optimistic?
Am I optimistic? I don't think you can be a Jew living in the year 2023 and not be optimistic. And the reason for that is that, like, every civilization, like, I know people are obsessed with the Roman Empire these days on TikTok, but like, look at the story of the people that I come from, right? Slaves in the Middle East, condemned, annihilated by so many civilizations and dictators, one in living history that killed 6 million Jews. And yet here I am, living in a country that gives me the same rights as anyone else, where Jew is not stamped in my passport, where I'm married to a woman, where I can walk down the street in a tank top with my baby, and I'm going to get smiles in most parts of this country. How can I not be an optimist? It's like guys, that is like, to say that's an anomaly in history is like the understatement of the century. My life wouldn't be possible in so many other places right now in the world. So am I optimistic? Hell yeah, I'm optimistic. Like, by the way, you know, it's easy to kind of crap on a lot of the terrible things that the internet, I mean, in a way, like the background to this entire conversation is the internet.
Sure.
And this revolution that's going to make the Industrial Revolution, frankly, look like nothing when AI is said and done. There are also incredible things that have come from that. And, you know, incredible progress being made. It's just that the pace of change is so dizzying and crazy making sometimes. But when I look at what's possible, when I look at the scientific advances that AI is going to make possible, like, I'm so deeply optimistic. I think about even what has changed in my own lifetime. And I'm full of optimism. So as worried as I am, and I think, you know, unless you have your head in the sand, there's a lot to worry about. I'm also profoundly optimistic about journalism, about this country, and about, you know, and I'll just say one last thing about, you know, that really speaks to what we're trying to do at the Free Press, like how a really small group of determined people can come and really change things for the better and make a home where a home didn't exist before. Like, that is so unbelievably energizing to me and really fills me with hope.
Well, I appreciate your comments tonight. I appreciate you joining us here. And I know I speak for the whole audience and being grateful for you coming here to Wisconsin to talk with us tonight. And I want to say thank you to the audience for the thoughtful questions and for participating. Please continue these dialogues with us. And just to continue to put a plug in for the Menard Center, We really can't do this without you, and we would love to hear your feedback and your thoughtful comments on ways that we can increase programming on this campus and beyond to have more speakers like Barry and other speakers that have a plurality of views. We need your help. Thank you so much. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
I
Barry.
really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.